Hi and welcome back to Storytime with Alex, reading from Allbyon to Britannia, Book 1, The Witches of Old Albion. Today I'm going to start reading The Witch and the Worm. It's split into 8 parts, but I'm going to read it over 2, because they're not that long. We start with a little note. For those of you who don't know, the O antiphons each begin with O, and are sentences sung before and after the Magnificat at evening prayer in the evenings before Christmas. 1. O Wisdom. In the days of old Albion, when the wolves still roamed, when wizards lived in towers and witches slept under hedges, at least according to the wizards, there lived a wandering witch called Anne Morrow. In recent generations some witches had ceased to wander and had taken to living in cottages, tending the people in villages nearby, but others trudged the roads of Albion with a scrip and a haversack, just as their foremothers had done since the time of the great flood, when Albion first became an island. Anne loved to wander through spring meadows bedecked with wildflowers, along sandy beaches in high summer, listening to the waves and the mewling of the gulls, and crunching the leaves as she trekked through the great forest in autumn. But this was December, and it was raining steadily, and the notion of a roof and a hearth and 4 walls was beginning to seem like heaven. She was bitterly regretting turning down an invitation to winter in the city of the White Tower. It had seemed too early in the autumn to settle at the time, but now it was 8 nights to Christmas. At evening prayers in monasteries, village churches, and mighty cathedrals, the O antiphons were being sung, and she had no idea where she would be spending Christmas Day, let alone sheltering from the cold of January. She also felt lost, not something she liked to admit even to herself. She had been walking the lanes and highways of the south for 20 years, but now found herself going westward on unfamiliar paths. There had been neither a cottage nor a barn for a day or 2, just the trees of the forest for company. She had spent last night in a tree, and her back still ached as a result. As the rain soaked her clothes, it was dampening her spirits, and she was beginning to doubt herself. She had said the prayer aright and thrown the stones, and they had told her to take this path to the west. But why? The path through the trees began to run uphill again, and she prayed to Mary, Mother of God, who had a special care for witches, that beyond there would be some kind of shelter that was not just more trees. As she crested the hill, she saw, through the curtain of rain, a small village in a valley. No one was out in the rain, but lights shone in the windows, and she fervently prayed for some kind of inn. She thanked the Blessed Virgin and set off down the hill. A bunch of dried hops dripped over the inn door as she entered. The room was not large, but there was a roaring fire and a bar with beer barrels. Apart from the innkeeper wiping down a table, there were only 3 people there, and an aging cat toasting itself by the fire. They all looked at her, not in an unfriendly way, but with the curious air of people unused to strangers. Anne felt an air of gloom she could not yet identify. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," she curtsied. "I am Mistress Anne Morrow. My rather wet garb, but you can see that I am a wandering witch, willing to help those in need and to accept a bite to eat in return. Good evening, Mistress Morrow. I am Joan, and my husband Jim and I keep this inn such as it is. You are welcome to food and a bed on this foul night, but the help we need might be beyond you." "Don't annoy the nice witch, Joan. If she turns you into a toad, you'll not be tall enough to serve behind your own bar." A tall, well-built man put down his ale and came forward and offered her his hand. "My name is Davy Locke. I'm the village smith and the village mayor. You are indeed most welcome to this village of Mickleton in the Vale. There are indeed many here in need of your help, injuries and ailments, teething babies and winter aches, hens not laying and the like. But we have a particularly large problem that may well mean that you think twice about staying, especially if you were looking to spend Christmas here. When you've had a chance to dry off and had a bite to eat, I'd be pleased to show you." She was shown into a neat little guest room at the back and changed into dry clothes. Her best red skirt and green cardigan made her feel warmer and cheerier, and a good supper of bread and mutton stew washed down with a strong cup of rosehip tea finished the job. It had finally stopped raining, and Davy Lock led her out into the village green. The twilight sky was clear and filling with stars, but there was no one about. To the west, on a hill rising up in the middle of the valley, she could now see the steeple of a church. "Do you see St. Michael's up on the hill?" "Indeed I do." "There lies our problem. Do you see it?" In the fading light there seemed to be a path winding around the hill to the church door. No, not a path. Some kind of hedge? Then she realized there was something in front of the church doors, a gleam and a glimmer, and suddenly she saw it for what it was. A gigantic worm was curled all around the hill, its head resting on the church porch, its tail poking through the lich gate at the bottom, its red eyes gleaming with an inner unearthly light, and its dark green scales glinting in the starlight like armour. "That dragon's been here since Advent Sunday, and shows no sign of shifting," said Davy Lock. "What we need is a mounted knight or two with swords and spears, begging your pardon, Mistress Morrow." "Well, to be accurate, it's a worm and not a dragon, for it has no wings. But that's no help to you. Is there no wizard in these parts?" The worm, ate the Wizard of Greenholt Tower on its way here. There's no one else in these parts but the monks by the sea. But Father Francis ran away when the worm arrived. To be fair to him, we were all terrified at first, but it just lies there. We'd be more frightened if it moved, but it doesn't." Said Anne. "Well, not sure what I should do, but it does seem that all you have is me." To herself she wondered if this was why she had been led west, but what wisdom did she have for a situation like this? What was she supposed to do? Part 2. O Adonai. The next day, with no ideas at all about the worm, she did what she always did when she arrived at a new village, and went from house to house offering her services. She made some herbal brews for various aches and pains, sang a couple of healing spells for broken bones, and even helped the midwife with an awkward birth, singing a spell to get the babe turned round in her mother's womb, and then delivered safely. She listened to people's worries, and by nightfall, as well as the usual concerns of a small village, she knew all there was to know about the coming of the worm. It had appeared out of nowhere on Advent Sunday, slithering and waddling on its short legs right through the village just as everyone was about to go to Mass. It headed straight up to the church and banged its head on the church door. Father Francis had opened the door, thinking it was someone from the village coming late, and almost fainted dead away. The crucifer had waved the processional cross at the worm, but it just howled or roared. People were undecided how best to describe the awful noise it made, but did not budge. When he came round, Father Francis had squeezed past the beast's head and run all the way back home to the monastery. It had come down the valley from the hills to the north, and the track it made was easy to see. When Davy Lock went to see the wizard, he found some of his clothes strewn across the path. He must have left his tower and been ambushed on the path as he was on his way to church. He didn't come often, but always came on Advent Sunday. At first the villagers had been so scared that no one would leave their homes, but it just sat there. The most awful thing was that they could not get into church. They had worshipped in the inn, though without a priest or a prayer book, but every time someone sang a hymn, the worm would roar or howl, and they had to stop. They hoped that God would understand. 3. A Root of Jesse. The next day was Sunday, and in the evening the village tried to hold its traditional carol service with candles and dancing, but anyone tried to sing or strike up a tune, the worm, who clearly had an acute sense of hearing, would make such a racket that they would have to stop. It was 5 days to Christmas. No one could get into the church, and no one could sing a song. They could not even set up the Christmas group in the village green, because all the figures were kept in the church vestry. It seemed that the worm was intent on preventing them from celebrating Christmas at all. 4. O Key of David. Monday morning, Anne awoke to the sound of hammering from the smithy. When she went to investigate, Davy Lock was making a sword. It was not something he was practised in. He usually made horseshoes and iron hooks and hinges, and the occasional lock and key, but it looked lethal enough to Anne. No mounted knight is going to come and save us from this monster, he said, wiping his forehead with a cloth. So I reckon we must do it ourselves. I'm going to make myself a sword and a shield and face the beast myself. Anne was alarmed. You're important to the people here, putting yourself in danger. What would the village do without you? I'm the village mayor. It's up to me to do something. Have you got any better ideas? She wished that she had. She needed to do something for these people. And so, after a morning of seeing away toothache and applying ointment to bruises, she asked the smith to come with her along the path to the north to try and find out where the worm had come from. It would at least put off his plan for another day, and perhaps it would give her a clue what to do. She really did not want the smith to get himself killed. The weather had turned cold, and the frost persisted in every shaded corner. It was easy to follow the worm's tracks, the claw marks as it waddled along, and the furrow of its tail as it dragged it along. Look, said Davy Lock, here's where the worm ate the wizard. A stocking was draped over a bush, stiff as a board in the frosty weather, its pair in the fork of a tree. A wizard's robe and what she took to be his underwear, not something she'd ever considered before, were lying ripped apart on the path, and what looked like the remains of a pointed hat were squashed flat in the frozen mud under the worm's tracks. It looked as though the worm had ambushed the wizard and then slithered off to the village. They walked on to the wizard's tower. The front door stood open. As she strode towards it, she realised that Davy Lock had stopped. If there's a spell on the door, we'll be turned to stone or something worse. She might not have the power to undo wizard's magic, but it was easy enough to detect. Anne hummed a spell and fluttered her hands. There was no spell, so why had he not locked his door when he left? She entered the tower. Cautiously Davy Lock followed. The key was in the lock on the inside. There was a pair of stout boots and a staff leaning against the wall, and a scrip and a woollen cape on a hook. The kitchen beyond was neat and tidy. They climbed the stairs to the wizard's study. It was lined with shelves of leather-bound books, and one great tome was open upon the oak desk. Gingerly she peered at it. Unsurprisingly, it was the wizard's book of spells, but she was careful to read none of the words, even in her own mind. Over a marble fireplace was an ornate mirror flanked by candle sconces. The candles burnt out and the fire cold. There were a couple of sketches, presumably done by the wizard, tucked into the frame. He was quite skilled. In one she recognised the parish church on its hill. She touched nothing. Better safe than sorry. She had a witch's distrust of book magic, and indeed anything belonged to a wizard. Wizards were fond of saying that witches were illiterate, but that was not generally true. Indeed, some witches had their own books of shadows, full of notes and sketches, recipes and songs, but they were not like the wizard's book. The letters marched across the page in ruled lines. She reflected that wizards' spells always went in straight lines, while witches' spells curled and eddied like smoke. She looked up and caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. She looked puzzled. She glanced down at the spell book again. She had to admit that it was very beautiful, with illuminated borders. She thought it just a pattern, but then realised that each border was formed by an undulating worm. When they returned to the village, Anne made her excuses and went off for a walk on her own. She needed some thinking time. She can have that thinking time, because that's where we're going to pause in this story. Please join us again tomorrow for part 2 of The Witch and the Worm.